Hello, good morning to all of you, and thank you for joining us today. Today, we have a meeting that's been organized by our students because our students wanted to celebrate the 160th anniversary of official diplomatic and cultural relations between Italy and the US. Actually, diplomatic relations started back in 1861, when the US, a relatively young country, officially recognized the newborn Italy. Actually, Italy in 1861, I'll remind our students of a point, Italy had not yet completed its unification process, not yet, and Rome was missing. And the unification of Italy was actually met, how could I put it, with mixed feelings. I'll be diplomatic, on behalf of its long-standing European neighbors. Well, instead, the United States reached out to this newborn country. Well, ever since, and even notwithstanding considerable geographic distance, which does make a difference, at least it did make a difference in those times, relations between the two countries have become tighter and tighter, especially after the Second World War, and especially after Italy's joining the North Atlantic Treaty. Since then, I would say that the two countries, I wrote down the words I wanted to mention, two countries have been allies, partners, and friends also. In economic fields, in the political sphere, but also, and this is a point I want to make, in the field of cultural relations. Now, while preparing this very short introduction, I Googled US-Italy cultural cooperation, and a number of documents appeared on my screen. And under the heading of each, there's that short description of the contents of the document. Well, one of the expressions that appeared almost all documents was people-to-people ties. I wrote it down. Well, in my view, this is a perfect way of describing the cultural links between the US and Italy. Now, if you think of it, generation after generation, Italians have shared American culture. If you think of it, we've shared American music, American films, American books, American literature, American food, American fashion, TV programs, whatever. I could go on for a very long time. I think that sometimes the younger Italians, many of our students probably, think that what everyday customs that habits of so many Italian people are actually native. But they're not native. They were at some point of time, they have been imported from the United States. Well, let's come to the more serious bit of it. I checked on the internet, and I discovered that the Fulbright Commission for Cultural Exchange with Italy is one of the oldest that has been established in Europe. It was created in 1948, when the Fulbright Commission was created only 2 years earlier. To date, it has financed something like 14,000 transfers of students, researchers, teachers between the two countries. Then there are a huge number, I won't mention anyone, of programs that bring managers, entrepreneurs from Italy to the United States and vice versa. But anyhow, I have the impression that Americans, especially young ones, don't really need Fulbright grants or any other grant to come to Italy. Before the pandemic, some 36,000 Americans came to Italy every year. And Italy is second only to the United Kingdom as a destination for young Americans. Well, coming to our part in all this, today we are hosting an interview with the American Embassy Cultural Affairs Officer, Mr. Rodney Ford. Now, this is just another instance of our people-to-people ties, because Mr. Ford is an active member in the steering committee of our master's degree in international relations. And if I may say, I think he's a long-standing friend of LUMSA. The interview was prepared by the students of our master's degree in international relations. And let me just mention the fact that it was conceived, organized, and carried out by a group of students that have created an organization that they call themselves the Cenacolo of Diplomacy and International Studies, Cenacolo of Diplomacy and International Studies. The Cenacolo is an organization created by students, for students, in which students meet to discuss on a peer-to-peer basis relevant topics of the syllabus for future careers in international organizations. Occasionally they invite their teachers, and occasionally they invite, like today, external experts, just to discover and to gain more insight into specific topics. Well, the last point, who are we going to thank for today's meeting? Well, first and foremost, let me thank Cultural Affairs Officer Rodney Ford. Also, let me thank Dottoressa Manuela Picozzi of the U.S. Embassy, who is always very cooperative and helps us to organize events from an insider's, obviously, position. And then, obviously, let me thank our students. So I'll just leave the floor to our students for their interview.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Professor, for this introduction. As you have just mentioned, the Cenacolo of Diplomatic and International Studies is an initiative born from the collaboration between 7 students of the master's degree course in international relations, which aims to create a dialogue between the students who have chosen to enroll in this master's degree course, driven by a great interest and motivated by the desire to deepen their knowledge in the field of international relations. Some of us aspire to take up a diplomatic career. Others wish to become analysts or officials in international institutions and bodies. However, many are the intrinsic difficulties connected with the realization of each of these dreams, and many are the constraints related to the availability of positions and the strong competition to face. For this reason, we believe it is extremely important to broaden our knowledge and horizons as much as possible. This is feasible thanks to the collaboration and the precious suggestions provided by our speakers. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting Mr. Rodney Ford, Cultural Affairs Officer of the United States Embassy in Rome, whom I would like to thank for the availability and enthusiasm he has shown for this initiative. Mr. Ford will share his experience as cultural attaché of the US Embassy. He will analyze the cultural and political values that have been uniting the US and Italy for 160 years, and will provide a reflection on the main challenges of cultural diversity today. At this point, I'd like to introduce him briefly. Mr. Ford holds a master's degree in National Security Studies from the National War College of the National Defense University, as well as a master's degree in political science from Georgia State University and a bachelor's degree in cultural anthropology from Emory University. Before joining the US Department in 2001, he worked for the Atlanta public school system in Georgia as research assistant. He has served in South Africa as consular officer and in Suriname as assistant cultural affairs officer. From 2007 to 2010, he was the public affairs officer at US Embassy Madagascar. Then he was the information officer at US Embassy in Rabat, Morocco, and at the US Embassy in Baghdad, Iraq. From 2014 to 2016, Mr. Ford served first as the spokesperson for the Bureau of African Affairs, and then as the Bureau's deputy director. In 2018, he arrived in Rome at the United States Embassy in Italy, where he currently serves as the embassy's cultural affairs officer and is co-chair of the US-Italy Fulbright Commission. He is also a member of the steering committee of our master's degree course in international relations. I am very much looking forward to this exchange today, and I would like to welcome Mr. Ford now. Good morning, Mr. Ford. I am very pleased that you have found the time for this meeting today, and I warmly welcome you on behalf of all the students who are participating in this event.
Thank you so much. It was a very nice welcome, and I enjoyed your professor's introduction. And I may have a couple of comments on that. That was quite interesting, and I'm really looking forward to speaking with you today. And hopefully it's useful for you and your fellow students.
Yes, I'm sure it will be. So today we are celebrating together the past, the present, and the future of friendship between Italy and the United States. So to begin with, I would like to ask you to tell us something about your experience as Cultural Affairs Officer for the US Embassy in Italy and about the most relevant cultural issues you've been dealing with.
Thank you. So, it's unfortunately, the last year and a half, I think we've all been dealing with COVID. So that's been a bit of a challenge, and we've had to kind of reorganize how we do our programs. But, to answer your first part, the 160th anniversary of relations between our two countries is very important. And I think most of you, if you are following international relations, which I know you are, your foreign minister, De Maio, recently visited the United States. He was the first foreign minister to be welcomed by our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken. And I think they both have reiterated the importance of the relationship between our two countries and the long-lasting friendship between our two countries and ties. And our last Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, was an Italian American, and I'm sure most of you know the long links between Italian Americans and back to Italy. And a lot of Italians, immigrated to the United States, but then many of them came back, and I think they created this bridge that's gone back and forth between our two countries. And I think in a lot of ways, our cultures are very much interrelated and interconnected. And I think that is important. I think, there are obviously a lot, and we'll get into this a little later, there's obviously a lot of stereotypes about Italians and about Americans between our two countries. But I think, at the root level, we have so much in common, and we share so many common values, and we're interested in the same things, and our goals and objectives for our countries and for the world and for our children and grandchildren, I think are the same. In terms of the biggest cultural issues I've been dealing with, one in particular, and you mentioned introduction as well as your professor, is the Fulbright Program. And the Fulbright Program started just after World War II, and the idea was, which is behind broadly a lot of the public diplomacy programs that we do, and cultural diplomacy is under the umbrella of public diplomacy for the United States, I think for many countries. And to me, exchanges are kind of at the root of this. And, because I can get up and talk to you about America and about Italian and American relations, but that's no substitute for you being able to travel to the United States and meeting Americans and seeing what Americans do, what Americans think. So exchanges really are kind of, they are at the foundation of relations between other countries, because in both ways, it's the same for the Americans that are coming to Italy and studying and doing research. And I think they're creating linkages between universities, they're creating linkages between individuals. And I think it's so important, because I think those are the things that help our countries to grow and to become even more interconnected. So I think as a broader issue, I know it's an academic exchange, but it's also a cultural exchange. And when we're interviewing applicants to participate in the program, one of the things that we always ask them is, what do you see as your role as a cultural ambassador for Italy going to the United States? What can you bring, not just in your academic excellence or your merit, but what can you bring culturally from Italy to share with American communities who may only know the stereotypes or may not really know much about Italy? So, seeing that is seeing the responses to that, and I think that weighs heavily in those that we select. But on other issues, I mean, it's there are a lot of things going on in the world. I mean, obviously, the COVID and dealing with pandemic and dealing with broader biological risk are kind of priorities for us. We've also dealt a lot with some of the economic issues, working with Italy on, our former ambassador used to call it, growing the pie, working on economic growth. We know that Italy's been facing a lot of challenges in that area with employment. And we do a lot of outreach to youth. Probably one of our flagship programs has been it's a Coding Girls. It's called Coding Girls, and it's with a local partner and also with the Ministry of Innovation. But it's introducing young women and girls to STEM fields, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, to get more. And this is not just an issue in Italy; it's an issue in the United States, that there are just not enough women in the science and tech fields. And I think that it's just opportunity. And so providing the opportunity for young people, particularly young women, to be involved in these areas, in these fields, has been particularly important for us. So those, that's just kind of a snapshot of what I've been working on, but that gives you a little bit of a flavor of the things that we've been focused on.
Thank you. I think this is very interesting, and I think I can say on behalf of all the students which are attending this event that this is a very important point. So as you said, the United States and Italy are very close countries, sharing the same value system, including the defense of human rights, for example, or the protection of democratic institutions. In the light of this, what I would like to ask you is, in your opinion, what are the most important cultural and political values that unite nowadays the US and Italy?
I think you hit on them. I think, human rights, basic civil rights, human dignity, are certainly paramount to both of our countries. And I think also we've been very involved in the well-being of our own citizens. And I think, this has never been more true and more clear than with this COVID crisis, with this pandemic that we've been facing, and how this shows us too, in the world today, how interconnected we are, how dependent we are on one another. And I think this, when you see how quickly the COVID pandemic spread, I think it took really a global response. And I think it was a little slow, because I think we were all a little surprised how quickly it spread. But I think once we kind of found our way, that we've been in it together. And I think that's been clear, for more than a year now, that we are in this together. Secondly, and I think it's probably, not probably, but it's obviously much more prominent with the entry of this new administration, the Biden administration, is the climate crisis. I know that the environment and climate change is very important to Italy and Italians. And I think it's equally important to America and Americans. And I think this is something I think that President Biden, Secretary Blinken have both prioritized, not just combating the climate crisis, but showing American leadership and showing American partnership and looking into the climate crisis. Because I think at the end of the day, that affects everything. That affects political issues, that affects economic issues, that affects humanitarian issues. So up and down the line, I think recognizing how important that is crucial. I think to our relations, but our interrelations. But I think it's also crucial to really try to do something about climate crisis, because I think talking about it is one thing, but actually doing something about it and taking action is another thing. And I think that this current administration, the Biden administration, takes it very seriously. The former Secretary John Kerry is our climate envoy. He is heavily engaged on this issue, and I know in particular because the Europeans and the EU are the leaders on these issues, and I know he's been engaged quite a bit with his European counterparts on the climate change issue. So I mean, I would say that those are kind of the important things. I mentioned some of the gender issues. I think LGBTQ issues are increasingly important for us. I think, it's no secret to anybody that the United States is still wrestling with racial tension, with racial issues. And I think it's very important. They're difficult conversations to have on these issues, but I think that they're issues that societies have to deal with because they're difficult issues. So I think that's something as well that we're dealing with internally, but I think it also has an impact on our international relations.
Yes, I couldn't agree more with you. They are very important. And you were talking also about living in another country. And if you agree now, I would like to move to this topic. We know that in a multicultural society such as ours, humans are defined by their differences. And while diversity brings us together, it is also something that distinguishes us. As a result, many people may experience a cultural shock when moving to a new country. In addition, diversity is often associated with a category of otherness, with one's own culture being considered the only true category. Thus, there is neither a desire for conflict nor for knowledge of the others. And this denial phase is distinguished by a tendency to use stereotypes, as you said, not to denigrate people, but to define them, because sometimes there is a lack of knowledge about them. So in order to get out of this phase, intergroup contacts must be encouraged. And in the light of this, I'd like to ask you, what are the shared stereotypes that define both countries, the US and Italy? And what qualities, according to your experience, do Italians find more appealing in Americans and vice versa?
Okay. I mean, stereotypes are hard. I mean, there are various different viewpoints on stereotypes, and I think, there have been scientific studies that show that human beings are wired to look for differences in one another rather than similarities. And I think that's sometimes why it makes it very challenging to overcome stereotypes. I think it's probably even increasingly more difficult now in an information age where there's a lot of information out there, and we as consumers of information, as citizens that live in democracies, really must work hard to filter through the information to look for, truth and fact are now difficult words to talk about, but that's in essence what we really are talking about. I mean, looking through, what various people are saying as opinions and trying to really kind of get at the root of what is the truth. And I think one of the issues on diversity is that, yeah, we are different, but I think, and my experience has been, is that in a lot of ways, culture is fluid. And I think that's true of Italy. I think it's particularly true of America because, in essence, America is a nation of immigrants. Everybody who's in America, who is an American, with the exception of the Native Americans, comes from somewhere else. And they bring their culture over centuries now into American culture. And I think what makes American culture, and this is one of the things that I've been asked, throughout my career, is like, what is American culture? And I think in a lot of ways, American culture is culture from all over the world. And I think it's, and I think I would say a little bit differently from what you said, that I think that what diversity is that it's a cumulative of all these different cultures. It's little parts of all the different cultures together. And I think what diversity allows for you to be your own culture within the broader culture. And I think that the broader culture is part of all these different cultures. And I think respecting other cultures within the context of what the broader culture is, I think is the most important thing. And I think in the United States, and we've just been talking about this, is that, if you have respect for human rights, if you have respect for civil rights, if you have respect for your fellow human beings, and, whether it's, gender issues, LGBT issues, religious freedom, if you buy into those ideals, then your culture will fit into American culture. And it's not always neat. Sometimes cultures bump up against each other because they're a little bit different. But my experience has been, and I think you are 100% correct about this, is that the more we know about each other, the easier it is to understand one another. And I think at the end of the day, I think we all want the same things. We all want safety. We all want security. We all want to be healthy. We all want to engage with our family and our friends. And we all want to enjoy our lives in a comfortable scenario. So I think once we come to the agreement on those things, I think all the other things are less important. But I think that's easier said than done, because oftentimes, I think my experience has led me to believe in a lot of ways that the human beings, it's not that they don't like change, but change is difficult. People get into a routine, or they see the world a certain way, and there's comfort in that. And I think sometimes when you are taken out of your comfort zone and things change, it makes it very difficult for people. And I think sometimes that's when you see some of the friction in societies, is in cultures, is when things are changing. Sometimes they maybe change it a little too rapidly for some people. But I think, in a lot of ways, change is inevitable. I think the world obviously is not as, it's different than it was a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, let alone 100 years ago, 200 years ago. So change is, it's what happens. And so how do we deal with the change? How do we deal with each other? If we recognize that we are all in this together, then it makes dealing with the change that much easier. But as I said, that's not an easy thing to do. And stereotypes. You deal with a lot of stereotypes, coming up, as whether as an American, whether as an African American, as a person of color in America. What are the stereotypes that people think? And so, I think we have to look beyond that to some extent, because I think we can't let that define who we are, both either as Americans or as individuals or as diplomats or, what have you, ever how people want to categorize you. Because I think who we are, we define who we are as individuals, and we can't let stereotypes define us.
Thank you. I really appreciated the image that you created when talking about different cultures that can live together. I think this is very important. And I also think that today cultures tend to influence each other with a very significant impact. And for this reason, what I would like to ask you is, what are, according to your opinion, the main challenges to enjoy cultural diversity while preserving, as you said, the peculiarities of each culture?
That's a good question, and that's a lot. I mean, the United States is wrestling with this a lot now, and I think that the key to resolving that is that people need to begin understanding that accepting someone else or someone else's culture, it doesn't detract from yours. It doesn't make yours any less. And I don't know if there's something similar going on in Italy. For the last couple of years, there's been this meme that says, in America, that says, human rights aren't like pie. It's like the more that I get doesn't mean the less you get, right? I mean, rights are equal. It's not, it's not like a 100%. Like if you get 51, I get less. Right. And I think that we as societies are only equal if we're all equal. And so I think that's one of the things that we have to strive for. But, as I said earlier, it's as things change, people often feel like that they're losing, that if somebody else is getting something, that somehow that they're losing. And we kind of have to move beyond that as a kind of as a mental framework that, the goal is to expand it for everybody. And if one succeeds, we all succeed. And if one fails, then we all fail. And we have to, as societies, boost each other up because I think that's the most important thing. And I know, I mean, it's, as I said, it's easy to say, and it's the challenges in getting people, out of a certain mentality and the way that they think about things. Because I mean, I think it's so many things, whether it's racism, whether it's sexism, whether it's anti-immigrant sentiment, it's taught at an early age, and people see this as a competition, that if this person gets something, then I lose something. And I think we have to get away from that mentality and be more accepting of others. So that's kind of what we should be striving for.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, I also think that rights must stay on the same level, and that if I have more rights, or if I give others more rights, this doesn't mean that I have less rights. This is very important also because I think that with the internet, some issues you talked about, racism, sexism, and so on, these issues probably weren't so relevant in the past because people who had the possibility to talk were just the people who had the power, and so now also the minorities can talk and they can say, no, this is not fair. No, I think I deserve more rights. So probably this is why today we are talking about these issues, but not because they weren't there, but just because now everyone has a microphone with the internet, so everyone has the possibility to say his point of view. So I completely agree with you.
I think that's true. And I think what people want, and I think this gets misinterpreted sometimes, is that I think, when we talk about, equality or equity in terms of rights or what have you, I think it's what people want is equality of opportunity. They don't want equality of outcomes, right? People just give me an opportunity for a good education, give me a good opportunity for a job. And then once I have that opportunity, it's up to me to make the most of it. It's up to me to achieve. I don't expect anybody to give me anything other than an opportunity that's equal to other people. What I do with that opportunity is up to me. And so, I mean, I think that's very important to talk about, that it's not like nobody's giving me anything. I mean, I think we, as members of the same society, I think we earned that right to the opportunity.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you. Yeah. You, as I also mentioned, you were previously at the United States. You served the United States in African countries such as Morocco, Madagascar, and South Africa. And you have been the Deputy Director of the Bureau of African Affairs. Considering now the similarities and the differences between American and African cultures, according to your experience, how can cultural diplomacy contribute to a better understanding and better relations between this major continent, the United States, and Europe? And what do you think is the key to establishing increasingly solid relations between Western countries in terms of values such as democracy and the African countries?
Well, I mean, that's a big question. I think there's been volumes and volumes of books written about this. Having lived, in a small number of African countries, I think, one of the big things is that we, as quote unquote the West, need to stop looking at Africa as if it's a country. There are many different countries, and there are many different cultures and subcultures, many different languages. The history is very different. And I know it's kind of easy to say Africa and look at Africa that way. And, I've looked at a lot of, my master's thesis when I studied political science was on democratization in Africa. It was on African politics. And so I've studied it, and I've lived it a little bit. And, it's a challenge in a lot of ways, because, Africa for so long was just seen as a resource for the West, for Europe, and for the United States. Whether it was kind of goods and services, or obviously it was a resource for human beings and slavery all over, not specifically in Europe, but certainly in the United States and the Caribbean and South America, into this last century, whether it was oil or precious gems or diamonds and gold and various other things. And I think people have not looked at Africa as as a partner, as countries, as a place where there is culture, and part of it is understandable, because cultures are ethnocentric in a lot of ways, is that we focus on ourselves. We don't always necessarily understand where others come from. But going against what I just said, but looking at Africa as a whole, there's a wealth of history. There's a wealth of knowledge. There's a wealth of culture on the African continent that I think is still surprisingly in the year 2021 is untapped. And one of the programs that President Obama started this is when I was working in our Africa Bureau. It was called the Young African Leaders Initiative, YALI for short. And it was a program that's primarily based on identifying future leaders around the continent, on entrepreneurship, on kind of civics and public service, to come to the United States for a 6-week internship program seminar, to kind of help prepare them to be future leaders on their country and in their countries. And I think a lot of what African countries are looking for is they're looking for partners, they're not looking for patrons. And I think a lot of the history of the, as I said, quote unquote, the West dealing with Africa has been this kind of, this patronizing attitude, and kind of even if it's like big brother, little brother, let alone, outright colonial imperialism, I think, is shifting. And I think, the post-colonial period in Africa really started in earnest in the 60s and into the 70s. And so that's really almost just, a lot of it occurred in my lifetime, or not that much longer. So, I mean, it's only been, 60 years of independence for these countries. And I think they started, at a disadvantage. They started behind, because their countries had been plundered. They had not been given the opportunity to organize themselves politically, socially, culturally. I think almost every geographic country boundary in Africa was drawn up by Europeans, by colonizers. So there weren't really natural boundaries. You had a local tribe or a local group of people, and they end up on two sides of a geographic boundary in two different countries where, they may be family, they certainly have cultural similarities, but they're living in two different countries. And so having to deal with that, how do you develop a country where there wasn't a country before? And how do you look at these things? And, and I think these are the things and when a lot of the reporting about Africa is on civil wars or on pandemics or on starvation or on corruption or on, some kind of human rights violations, when it's so much more than that. And I understand how the media works, and people want to. It's easier for people to write and read about kind of tragedy than to read about something kind of small that needs to blossom and needs to be nurtured to succeed. So I think those are some of the things that we as America, as European countries can do to kind of nurture our relationship with African countries. And it takes time, it takes effort, it takes patience to just kind of continue moving along. And I don't want to get too deep into the broader political part of it, but there's been an ongoing issue with how China works and interacts with Africa, and how the United States works and interacts with Africa. And I think one of the things that we have generally had as a policy is that in the long run we are interested in long-term relationships with countries. And then get more to the point of your question on cultural diplomacy, it's the interaction between Americans and people of these countries. There was a famous quote from early days of public diplomacy for American. We call it the last 3 feet. And it's being on the ground, talking to people, interacting people, and not just kind of a top down, here's the solutions for your problems, but really talking to people and trying to understand what their issues are. And I think, as we've been talking about, what you understand is that their issues are the same issues that we've been talking about. What they want for themselves, for their families, for their societies, for their countries is the same things that we want. They want safety and security, and they want a future for their children. They want to live in healthy societies. In a lot of places, they want clean water, they want sanitation. And I think that's obviously not much to ask for. I mean, that's basic human standards.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, it will be a long process, but it is very important that also young people focus on these issues, because we are the future leaders. You talked about this program for future leaders, and I think all my colleagues agree that this is a very important point. And now I
should add on that we have a similar program in Europe. That's for young leaders in Europe as well.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. And now I'd like to ask you a rather more personal question. I would like to know, what were your expectations of Italy before moving to Rome, and if living in Italy has confirmed them, or if the image that you had of Italy has changed over the years?
So there's a couple of questions in there. One of the things that I have made a determined effort in my career is to kind of limit my expectations. And I think, you mentioned earlier about culture shock and dealing with different cultures. I think people have culture shock to some extent because they have unrealistic or uninformed expectations about what they're going to experience. So, before I moved here to work at the embassy, I had visited Italy several times as a tourist, and it's a very different experience living here than it is as a tourist. Because as a tourist, you're almost kind of in a bubble. I mean, you kind of you see a certain part of a country that not that it's fabricated, but it's almost superficial, right? Because you're only seeing the surface you don't live there on a regular basis, and so you don't really see. And there's no value, there's no good or bad, or one is better than the other. But when you live somewhere, you get a much better sense of who the people are, what are their concerns, what is life like, and so I mean, I wouldn't say I had expectations before I moved here, but I certainly had probably a conception of what I thought Italy was like, from being a tourist. And I'm in no ways now, like, I would not consider myself an insider. I have better insight to Italy and Italian culture, but I certainly have a different perspective living here than I did as a tourist. And kind of when you look behind the curtain a little bit, so to speak, in Italy, what you see, what I see, I should say, is a country that is foundationally built around kind of the family and family relationships and friendship relationships that really is the core of Italian culture. And I think that, and building out from there, I think it's interesting. Like, sometimes when you ask, people always ask, when you're an American, like, where you're from. And I grew up in the South, in Tennessee, but I think it's very similar in Italy. People ask where you're from, and the first thing people say is not they're Italian. They say the city they're from, or the province they're from, or the region they're from, because I think that's foundationally how people kind of see themselves. Where are you from? Where are your roots in Italy? And I think I think for both of our countries, that's what makes a challenge for immigrants or people that are new, is that if you don't have long-standing roots in one place, it makes it a little bit more challenging to kind of find your way. And I always laugh, because one of the things that I've always heard is, people say, oh, to be a real Roman, you have to have lived in Italy for 7 generations. And like, well, how many people have lived 7 generations in Rome, but I think are still like Romans? I mean, in every sense of the word. But I think it's that aspect of Italy that people really see, where they come from, and then it goes up to being Italian or up to being European. But I think it's that kind of core, in America, we call it like family values, being who is your family, and, who are the, and I think a lot of it is trust, and, who are those people around you that kind of give you your foundation.
Mm-mm. And do you have any particular memory or feeling from your time in Italy that you will never forget?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of it, probably first and foremost is the relationships that I've developed with the Italians that I work with in the embassy. We have a great staff. Your professor mentioned Manuela Picozzi, who I've worked really close with on a number of programs, and working in when you work with somebody, you're certainly are a colleague, and you have a relationship. But I think beyond that, enjoying the people you're working with and sharing experiences with them, I think is most important. I mean, one, it makes for a more productive working relationship, but then also just makes it more of a pleasure to be able to come to work every day when you enjoy the people you work with. And then secondly, the opportunity to travel. Obviously COVID in the last year and a half has hampered that a little bit, but I've had the opportunity to see a lot. I mean, this is a beautiful country, all over from south to north. So, seeing, and I think in Italy is very similar to the United States in that way, is that there are, geographically it's very different north to south. Subculturally it's very different north to south. So being able to see some of those differences and being able to appreciate that, I've really enjoyed that.
Perfect. And I have for you a different question now. I would like to ask you to imagine that you had the task of setting up an exhibition to present the United States to Italy. What would you include in this exhibition that most accurately represents your country to Italians? And vice versa, what would you include in an exhibition to present Italy to the Americans? And you can choose, for example, more elements like a work of art, a product, an agreement, a photo, a song, whatever you prefer.
I think for America to Italians, I would show a timeline of progress for America to really understand the history of our country and kind of where we've come. As a country that we say was founded on democracy and freedom, yet at the same time enslaved people and and moving towards a country that is trying to be better, bit by bit over a period of time. And I think in the short history of our country, I think we've achieved a lot. We have a lot further to go. We have a lot more to achieve. But I think in a lot of ways that encapsulates kind of what the United States is. For Italy, it's harder for me to speak for Italy. I mentioned family, but I think there's so much history and culture that kind of comprises Italy that goes back, unlike America, that goes back millennia. And I think that all of those parts are Italian, whether it's, kind of the history of Rome and the Romans up through, Da Vinci and the Renaissance and what that means, and poetry and sculpture and Michelangelo. And I mean, it's a wealth of history and culture that comes through today. And one of the programs that we've worked on with the Center for American Studies here in Rome is they have a prize every year for Italian Americans, and they give it to and it really is kind of the full range of researchers and scientists and engineers and actors and directors and musicians. And you see these people who are Italians who have gone to the United States and blossomed. And it really is, it's kind of the best of both of our countries. And I think that's those impressions that leaves with me.
Thank you. I think that you chose history, and this is a very interesting starting point also for all the students who are attending this event. Just one last question now. I'd like to go back to the anniversary that we are celebrating this year. This 160th anniversary of US-Italian diplomatic relations marks a turning point in the US-Italy friendship and the broader transatlantic alliance as the Biden and Draghi administrations take office. Do you think that the US and Italy can use their strong historical partnership to foster international cooperation on global issues such as the COVID-19 relief and economic recovery?
100%, absolutely. And I think not only can we, but I think we are. I think it's evident in what is happening in our current relationship. I think it's already happening.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we are approaching to the end of this meeting, and I would like to thank you again, Mr. Ford, for having found the time for this enriching exchange today, and also for the valuable insights and suggestions you have provided us with. In the previous meetings provided by the Cenacolo, we hadn't had the opportunity to deepen the role of the cultural attaché yet. I'm sure that this exchange would be very useful for all the students who participated and had the opportunity to learn more about this professional profile in the field of international relations, also in view of the job opportunities that the international sector offers and to which, as I said, we aspire. I would like to thank at this point Professor Di Maio for having supported us since the beginning of this project, and also the co-founders, whom I would like to mention: Enea Belardinelli, Grazia Granati, Federica Leone, Maria Felicita Mucci, Alessandra Spadafora, and Ilaria Tassari, without whom this project wouldn't have been possible. I would also like to thank the LUMSA communication area that supports us with great patience, and last but not least, all of you who participated in this meeting today. I take this opportunity also to remind you that next week there is another event promoted by the Cenacolo entitled Prospettive di pace e di sviluppo nella regione africana dei Grandi Laghi, which will take place on the 3rd of May. On this occasion, we will have the pleasure and honor of hosting Ambassador Baroncelli. So at this point, I will leave the floor to Professor Chapman, which I also want to thank you, and I leave her the floor for a final greeting.
Well, there's not much I must add, really. Just I'll thank everyone again once more, and have a nice day.
Thank you. Have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. It was very interesting and stimulating.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice day. Bye.
Bye.